Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session on how to prepare a proposal for a review article. Your presenters today are Matthew Pavlovich and Andrea Stephens. Matthew is the editor of the Trends in Biotechnology, Cell Press's home for reviews in applied biology. He earned his BSc in chemical engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology and his PhD in chemical engineering from the University of California, Berkeley, where he studied the biological effects of air plasmas. He also studied the analytical chemistry as a postdoc researcher in Northeastern University and then joined Cell Press at the start of 2016. Matt is a senior manager in the Trends Group and is part of the editorials team for the Cell Press podcast and Cell Mentors. Andrea received her PhD from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, where she studied insect-plant interactions in an invasive weed. This continued her interest in innovation biology, which she developed while working as a research associate at Plant and Food Research in New Zealand. Following her PhD, she moved to Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, for a postdoc looking at plant defenses, and then back to the Northern Hemisphere for a second postdoc at the University of Oxford. She joined Cell Press in November of 2018. My name is Shiva Agarwal. I am the scientific editor for the multidisciplinary Cell Press journal iScience, and I'll be your moderator today. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we start. Today's session will last approximately 60 minutes. After Matt and Andrea have delivered their presentations, we will then consider some questions that you can ask. These questions you can ask at any time during the webinar at all. You can also visit the Researcher Academy website to pose any remaining questions to other researchers just like you. One last announcement before we move on. The slides of this presentation and any other documents relevant to this webinar can be found under the tab Downloads on the right-hand side of the Researcher Academy screen. So thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you, Matt and Andrea.
Great, thank you, Shiva, for the introduction. As Shiva mentioned, we'll be talking to you today about writing proposals for review articles. Again, here's me on the left and Andrea on the right. You can see our respective email addresses and Twitter handles here if you're interested in getting in touch with us after the webinar. So I'd like to start by talking about what is a proposal. I'm going to define this as your way of asking for an invitation to submit a review article. You don't always need to do this. At some journals, you can just go to the submission website, like Editorial Manager, upload your article, and press the submit button. This is exactly the same way that you would submit a research article. But it may or may not be possible to do this at every journal. For instance, the Trends family that both Andrea and I work on, you can't just go to the website, submit the review, and have it proceed to peer review. So in that case, you instead need to ask for an invitation. Some ways that happens is maybe the editor, me or Andrea or somebody else, contacts you with an invitation to write an article. So this is me saying, hey, Dr. So-and-so, I really like your expertise in this field. I'm very interested in having you write for our journal. Would you do it? And then we hope you say yes. The other way that might happen is if you, the writer, contact me, the editor, to request an invitation. And that's going to be my proposal, and that's going to be the topic of this webinar, how and why you might want to do that. You also might hear this term pre-submission inquiry. This is sort of publisher jargon, and it's the same thing for asking the editor if your article is a good fit for that journal. So for a research article, a pre-submission inquiry is generally you asking the editor if that journal is a suitable place for your study. And usually you've already done the study, you've already written the paper, you have the manuscript ready to go, and you're saying to the editor, okay, I have this ready, is this going to be good for your journal? That's not quite what we're talking about here. It's similar, but there's a subtle difference. For reviews, it's really interchangeable. Pre-submission inquiry and proposal are basically the same thing. I prefer proposal because I think it's a lot easier to understand, especially for a broad audience. I think pre-submission is kind of too jargony and too insidery, but you will sometimes see that term, and so I wanted to make sure that I introduced it first. So an important question, why do we as editors care? Why do we want to see these proposals, and why can't you just go ahead and submit your review article? For you, it saves you work. Sometimes we can't take your proposal on, and we'll talk more about that later in this talk. It's not saying that your proposal's bad, it's not anything against you, but occasionally we just don't have the room for another review article. And so if you first write a proposal, send it to the editor, and say, is this interesting for your journal? We can say no before you've gone through the effort of writing the entire article. But for us, it helps us better understand a few things about what you're trying to do. So we understand the scope better, the take-home messages of your article, the niche that paper is going to fill, and what communities it's going to appeal to. I really like collaborating with my authors. I see my job as editor not as really the gatekeeper, but as more of a facilitator. I'm going to help you get your message out there and deliver it in the best way possible. And so by starting this proposal, rather than sending me the entire manuscript, that helps me get involved earlier in the process. I also get to know your writing style. So sometimes authors send me a proposal that's really hard to read. Maybe it's full of technical detail, or it's got a lot of terminology I don't understand. And if I can't understand what you're proposing, there's a good chance I might not also understand your entire review article. Sometimes, rarely, but more often than I'd like, I get an entire 6,000 word paper sent to my inbox, completely unsolicited. There's a lot of reasons not to do that. One of them is that maybe you just can't revise it at that point to fit the journal style. For instance, maybe there's too much math, or it's too detailed and there's too much technical content. Maybe there's just not room for it. So we publish a certain number of reviews every month. I publish about 10 articles per month. And if I get proposals from many more than that, I just can't fit them into my publication schedule. Maybe it's not a good fit. So my journal, Trends in Biotechnology, focuses heavily on applied biology and technologies. And so if I get a proposal for a review about basic biology, I usually have to turn it down. If I get a 6,000 word review that's already written about basic biology, that's a lot of work that you, the authors, had to go through that I unfortunately don't have the ability to accept. Again, there's no room for collaboration. So maybe you, as the expert in the field, have a really strong idea of the direction you want to take your paper, but I also have some advice based on my expertise of how it's going to best appeal to our audience. And if you write the whole thing without asking us for our input, we don't have the ability to collaborate. And finally, it cuts in line of other proposals. So the way that our journals work is on this idea of a pipeline. I have a proposal, maybe it's submitted today, and I say, this looks good. Can you write the article over the next 3 or 4 months and then submit it in the spring? And I try to keep that going as steadily as possible. If you instead send this paper to me today and say, hey, it's ready to submit tomorrow, that cuts in line, that sort of disturbs this careful balancing act that we're trying to do as editors. I also want to mention how this is different from a cover letter, because this is a question that I get very frequently. Again, this proposal is meant to introduce a manuscript that hasn't been written yet. So this is you saying, this is my idea. If you like it, I'm going to then write a review article. But a cover letter is something that you send along with the manuscript that's already been written. So the point of a cover letter is to introduce the authors and the topic, maybe explain why the manuscript is interesting, and then possibly suggest or oppose peer reviewers, although I think this is a little bit more common in the older days before we had online submission systems. There are some similarities. So in both a proposal and a cover letter, you want to convey excitement. You want to say why this is a timely and a novel idea. You want to explain the fit with the journal. And I say take time to learn the editor's name. We get an unbelievable number of emails that start with something like "Dear Sir" or "Dear Editor," and we respond a lot better if you've taken the time to get to know who we are. You know, just a simple "Dear Dr. Pavlovich." I know that a lot of my colleagues, when they get something like "Dear Sir," don't react to it as well if they're women. We have a whole Cell Mentor post about writing cover letters written by another one of my colleagues. And so if this is an interesting topic for you, I really encourage you to see that post. But the rest of today's topic, or the rest of today's webinar is going to focus on the topic of proposals.
Okay, so now I'm coming up on. So why do we ask for certain information in a proposal? First of all, we need the article working title. So don't worry, you absolutely won't be held to this title. At the bare minimum, we need a title to generate an invitation to submit. However, I'm going to say that titles are really important for the final paper. They are what draws the reader to your piece, so it's really worth thinking about this for your first reader, the editor. Does the title grab me, or do I think, ugh, not another one? Second, we need to know who is writing the piece. So a list of author names and where you are based. ORCID IDs are really helpful if you have them. This is particularly if your name is common or you've recently moved institutions. What we're looking for here is whether your author team has the necessary expertise to write the piece that you are proposing. So what is the necessary expertise? We absolutely don't just look at your H-index and say, oh, that's high, so okay. What we're looking for is some solid primary research in well-respected journals on the same topic. And also older reviews are fantastic because it shows you actually know how to pull together a review article. I'd also like to point out that it's the expertise across the entire author group we're looking at. So a PhD student plus an advisor would likely meet this sort of bar. Now, if you feel that a search of your name won't adequately highlight your expertise, so feel free to provide some additional context. So, for example, you might have been involved in a government report recently that I won't be able to access, I won't know about, so tell me about it. So next is the point-by-point summary describing what the review will cover. This is really the meat of the proposal, so this is where you should spend the bulk of your time. In essence, you simply need to give a brief outline of what you aim to cover with the piece. What is the big question you plan to cover? And also importantly, where are the edges of the topic? Are you just thinking about covering this idea in, say, vertebrates or plants? Tell me that. So I'm looking to determine whether the proposed review is likely to be the right size for the journal. Pieces can be too broad or they can be too narrow in scope. A piece that's too broad won't be able to say anything novel within the word limits, while a piece that's too narrow won't be of sufficient interest to the broad readerships that we have in the trends journals. We also need to know what you plan to cover so that we can compare it with other review articles, both within our journals and with recently published pieces in other journals. I'm also looking for pieces that are timely and novel. The requirement for timeliness and novelness depends with the journal. Some journals don't have this requirement. So I'm wanting to know, why should we be publishing a piece on this topic now? So is this a new idea? Is this a new way of thinking of something that's emerged recently? Has there been a major breakthrough requiring a rethink of old literature? Is there a major event coming up, a big conference that this topic speaks to? Sometimes it's simply that the topic hasn't been reviewed for a number of years, but the amount of primary literature has grown such that a synthesis would be really helpful to pull the disparate threads together. Finally, we ask for a list of references. We ask for 10 to 20 recent references. Now, we ask this for a number of reasons. First, I'm looking to see if the references you've chosen indicate that your paper will be a good fit for my journal. So I know what journals cite Trends in Ecology Evolution articles, and I know which journals Trends in Ecology and Evolution articles cite. So I'm hoping to see a range of those journals in this reference list. An excellent reference list will demonstrate to me that this article has the potential to be of interest to a broad cross-section of my journal's readership. So sometimes I get proposals that suggest the article will be a better fit for another journal. For example, if all the references are to microbiology journals, this would suggest to me that the manuscript might be a better fit for Trends in Microbiology. As an author, it is absolutely in your best interests to have the best match between the journal and your article. The better this matches, the more interested and engaged readers you'll get to your piece. Second, I'm looking to see whether or not the topic is timely. If all the papers are old, this suggests there probably isn't sufficient interest in at the present time for an article on this topic. If there isn't any recent papers, but you really feel that the time is right, you're going to need to tell us why. For example, there might have been a recent advance in another field that will review interest in the topic. So here, bioarchive papers are fine to show timeliness, or other preprint service are fine to show the timeliness, but you shouldn't rely on them entirely. It's really hard to assess fit if you're only showing this with bioarchive papers. Third, you want to highlight the novel aspects of your work. So this might require annotating your reference list to explicitly state how your piece differs from these other articles. Something like, this article says X, we take the opposing view arguing Y, or you might use the reference list to show that while people have considered two factors in isolation, you will be the first to put them together. And in this case, you might categorize them. So essentially, all of these elements help us to assess the proposal. Missing some of these will at worst lead to your proposal being declined. And at the best, the editor will come back to you and request you provide the necessary information before proceeding with their assessment. So the information I outlined above was really for review and opinion articles in the Trends journals. It's what we asked for review and opinion articles in the Trends journals. However, every journal publishes a range of article types. Listed here are some of the article types that are published in the Trends journals. When proposing an article, please tell us what article type you're thinking of. I'm really not very good at reading a mind. And if you're not sure, that's okay. Often people will say, I'm not sure if this should be a science and society or a scientific life. I can have a look and I can discuss that with you. So note that the information required for proposing different article types can differ. As I said, the information I went through earlier was primarily with reviews and opinions in mind. It's very similar to Science and Society and forum articles. Now, in the Trends group, spotlights and book reviews are in response to a recent paper or a book. If you're interested in writing a spotlight, it can be really helpful to supply the paper, just so we don't have to waste time tracking it down. And in both cases, tell us what you think is significant about this publication, be it an article or a book in particular. Why should the readers of my journal be excited and need to know about it? Some Trends journal publish letters. Trends in Ecology and Evolution publishes a lot of letters. Because there are only 700 to 800 words, we tend to ask you to supply the entire letter. Now, after we've assessed the piece, sometimes we all think that a different format might be more appropriate. For example, if we don't feel there's sufficient primary literature on the topic for a review at the present time, we might suggest discussing a forum article with you. We might see that what you really want is to promote some sort of policy alternatives, in which case a Science and Society article might be a more suitable format. And in this case, the editor will discuss this with you. So now I'm going to hand back to Matt.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the information that you include in a proposal. And I've come up with a scale here about how important these things are, from absolutely critical to maybe interesting to really not that useful at all. So to start with the things that are absolutely critical, I would say anytime the journal asks for something explicitly on its website, that's something that you definitely need to include in your proposal. It might sound obvious. Again, these are things that Andrea just mentioned, but an explanation of what the topic is and why it's timely, your list of recent references, the format, again, please specify which format you're trying to propose an article for, and the list of authors and affiliations so we can assess that expertise. A few things that are possibly informative, but probably not absolutely necessary. Sometimes we'll get a longer outline, including planned figures or section and subsection headings. That's fine. You can choose to include that if you want, but it's probably not critical. And sometimes we'll also get proposals that include a preferred submission date. Again, you're welcome to suggest one, but often the editor will prefer something else. Going back to my example earlier about cutting in line, sometimes we'll get the proposal saying, okay, this is going to be ready in 3 weeks, when really we would honestly prefer it in 3 months. Some things are just not that useful. Sometimes we'll get proposals with really long author biographies. I have published this many papers in this many journals, and here's my H-index, and here's all these prestigious grants that I've gotten. That's great. We're really excited that somebody with that much expertise wants to write for us, but we will also look you up. We're going to go to your institution website and get a feel for what your lab studies. We're going to go to something like Scopus and learn about what papers you published recently. Another thing that's not that useful is the word count, the number of references. Frankly, I don't want you to know the word count at the proposal stage, because that, again, suggests to me that you've already drafted the manuscript, and that's something that we don't want you to have done. The third thing here, I say this ubiquitous bar chart of number of publications versus time. Everyone knows what this looks like. It's sort of exponentially increasing, and it's meant to illustrate how, 10 years ago, there wasn't that much interest in this topic, and now there's a lot of interest in this topic. I would rather you explain that in words in the proposal and illustrate why this is an important thing for us to consider, rather than just telling me, okay, well, last year there were 80 publications, and this year there have been 120. I don't think that's that useful for me to understand the importance of the topic. Finally, flattery. You might think this is a joke. It is not. Occasionally we get these proposals that are like, dear respected editor, we are very excited and humbled to propose this article to your prestigious journal. Again, I like that you think that my journal is prestigious. I appreciate that you think that it's going to be a good opportunity for you, but that's not going to necessarily increase my chances of accepting the proposal. Just be professional, be polite. It doesn't need to be overly formal, and just say, dear Dr. Pavlovich, we'd like to propose this article. Here's why. I'd like to talk about customizing your proposal for different journals. And this is a little bit different from what Andrea just talked about in terms of customizing for formats. We really want to show the editor, or you as an author really want to show the editor, that you're paying attention to what that journal is interested in for its reviews. So follow the directions specific to that journal that the journal lists on its website. And every journal that wants proposals is going to tell you how to do it specifically for that journal. I think if you follow the directions that I give you on my website for writing a proposal, it's more likely that you're going to follow the directions that the journal suggests for writing the whole article. And you really don't want to make it seem like the journal you're proposing to is your plan B. So if I go to the Microsoft Word Get Info and see this on your proposal document, I know that you aren't writing the proposal just for me. I am not M. Sudgeon, and my journal is not published by the Royal Society of Chemistry. So please don't just recycle the proposal using some other journal's template and then forward it on to me after your first choice rejected you. It's totally okay if you originally proposed your review somewhere else. Sometimes one journal you think is going to be a good fit for you, and they say, no, it's not a good fit. And then you say, oh, well, maybe Trends in Biotechnology is better. That's completely fine. But I really strongly encourage you to show genuine interest in wherever you're proposing to in that moment, rather than just giving the impression of shopping around to anybody who will take your article. Andrea is going to talk a little bit about exceptions from author guidelines and when you can request them.
Okay, so sometimes you'll see the author guidelines on the website and you think, I need an exception. Oh, so the earlier you do this, the better. We do totally realize, that sometimes you won't be able to do this at the proposal stage. It will come up during the writing of the piece. For the trends journals or the Cell Press journals, we always say, get in touch then. As soon as you can, we're always happy to discuss exceptions to the guidelines. Now, guidelines have different levels of breakability. So whether or not you can break them is going to differ. And this differs with the different article types. And I fully acknowledge that it's very difficult from the outside for you to know whether the guideline that you would like to break is indeed breakable. However, you might get some idea if you can see that it's been broken in the past for your article type. For example, if you want to write a 5,000 word spotlight article, you won't see any examples of this. This increase of word limit is not possible, and as a result, an exception won't be granted. However, finding an example does not absolutely mean you will be able to break it. So there are a number of reasons for this. First, the article you are looking at might have a history you are not aware of. For example, it might have started life as another article type. Second, the guidelines and policies surrounding article guidelines change all the time. If an article's been in the production process for a long time, it may have been grandfathered in under old rules. So always ask. It's much better to ask than to assume and to have the paper sent back to you to bring into the guidelines. When asking, it helps to clearly define what you need. So you might ask, could box 2 be 600 words rather than the standard 400? You will need to explain why you need this. For example, box 2 explains how this phenomena, the phenomena that we review, can be applied to the treatment of major human disease X. And we think this is very important. But we feel that reducing this to 400 words will mean that some of the important nuances and limitations of this will be lost, for example. One request I frequently get is an exemption from the stated number of authors. So, as the lead author, there was a reason you invited each of your co-authors to contribute to this review article. I'm going to need you to articulate what was that reason and why you need this expertise. Finally, as I said before, it's not always possible that an exception to the guidelines will be granted to you. So have a think about what your backup plan might be. So what I said before about extending box 2 to 600 words, you might decide that rather than having a box covering human disease, you might remove that box altogether and just pop a sentence in the text referring the reader to the primary literature if they want to know about application to human disease. And then if you're really crafty, you'll also plan a broader review on that topic. So the next thing we're going to cover is what does it mean if the editor says no? So first thing I'm going to state that acknowledge that many journals are heavily oversubscribed. As the editor of Trends in Ecology and Evolution, I could fill half a dozen journals with what is pitched to me every month. As a result, I'm frequently saying no to pieces that I actually think are perfectly reasonable and have potential. Your article may simply fall into this category. It's absolutely no fault of your own. There's no, I would love to take the piece. I'm just full up. Second, we need to balance all the subfields covering the area by the journal. At the moment, for obvious reasons, I'm getting a lot of papers about infectious zoonotic diseases, about the evolution of zoonotic diseases, about wildlife reservoirs, and I simply can't take them all without becoming trends in zoonotic disease. So over the course of the year, I'd like to balance across all major areas, a balance of evolution, conservation, plant ecology, animal behavior. And taking too many papers in one area means that I won't be able to take papers in other equally important areas. So related to this, even if your broad topic area, plant ecology, is not oversubscribed, I may simply have a paper in the production line that covers similar ground. So while obviously no two papers will be the same, we aim as best as we can to reduce redundancy. And if this is the reason we say no, this is not something we would ever expect you to realise. Sometimes we say no because we don't think it's the right time or that my journal is not the right one. There have been a large number of reviews on the topic, particularly if there's been a special or a recent special issue. It's unlikely there is space for another one. When I assess a proposal, this is something I actively look for. Too many reviews dilutes the impact of any one review. If you know there have been other reviews recently, but genuinely think that you have something unique to say, you will need to do that much more work to demonstrate this in your proposal. Finally, my journal may simply not be the right fit for your article. As alluded to when we talk about references, sometimes people pitch papers that only tangentially fall into the remit of the journal. And it's absolutely everybody's best interest to get the right match. A right match means that you will have more readers and a more engaged readership. And a more engaged readership ultimately leads to more citations. Finally, the scope of your piece may not fit. At Trends in Ecology and Evolution, I often get papers that focus on a particular species or a region of the world, or both. Your review on hibernation in dormice in Germany might be the best review of German dormouse hibernation actually ever written in the history of the world. But for me, the scope is too narrow, and so it would be a better fit for a mammal journal or one specialised on hibernation strategies. A review, however, of hibernation strategies would probably be a better fit to a journal with a broad global scope. The next thing I'd like to touch on is about what makes that absolute must-take proposal. What is that X factor? And Matt's going to touch on this a little bit more in a moment. First, it absolutely isn't about having a big name on your paper. You do not need to go and find a outstanding researcher. It's about ideas, not about people. But there isn't one simple thing that makes your paper stand out. Like a good grant proposal, it's about having a well-formulated question of general interest and clear, well-thought-through logical arguments. An excellent proposal also has a reference list that demonstrates it will be of interest to a good proportion of the journal's readership. So I would always suggest, once you've got your proposal draft, as long as you go down the hall and get other people to read it, people who are in your department but work on different topics. So people who are the potential readers of Trends in Ecology and Evolution, but may not be in your subfield. Now, do they think it sounds exciting? Would they read your article? If they wouldn't read your article, then why? Do they think it seems too narrow? Do they think it seems too technical? Remember, you're only asking them to read 300 to 600 words. So getting this feedback will have a very high potential payoff. So good luck, and Matt's going to cover a little bit more.
All right, thank you. So I want to expand on that discussion by talking about what makes me as an editor want to say yes to your proposal. One thing might be a concept that was part of every talk at a recent conference. So let's say that I'm attending the biggest society meeting in the world for a specific field, and there's this new molecular assay that keeps showing up in every single talk. Or there's this new class of natural products that everybody's engineering their microorganism to make. If I then get a proposal 2 weeks later saying, hey, I was also at this conference, I heard everyone talking about this new assay or this new category of products, I think it would be timely to write a review on it. That's going to make me want to say yes, because I've also seen that that topic is novel. Similarly, a truly new way of thinking about a topic, and Andrea talked a lot about this too. I would encourage you to show, not tell your idea as novel. So you could simply say, this is a new review on this topic, but instead you might want to say, we were the first to connect this concept with this practice, or to suggest that this, not that technology, might be the better way of doing things. I really want a story that's obvious to me. I have sort of a broad but shallow expertise in everything that my journal publishes, but you, the author, are really the big expert in the narrow topic of your review. So sometimes we'll get proposals along the lines of, okay, well, there's a lot of reviews about disease X, therapeutic Y, and device Z, but we, for the first time, are talking about using specifically device Z to deliver therapeutic Y to treat disease X. And that seems like a really small target to hit. That's like it can be a very niche idea, and it might be novel and it might be new, but I don't necessarily understand why that particular combination of things is exciting. I like seeing an author list that reflects intentional collaboration. So rather than just, okay, well, this is me as an associate professor and my postdoc and my graduate student, and then a guy down the hall that I collaborate with sometimes. I think I really like seeing, okay, well, here's an author who has expertise in taking technology to market. And here's an author who has expertise in molecular biology. And here's one who has expertise in microbiology. And here's one who has government policy regulation expertise. I think that's a really interesting list in a way that just, okay, here's my lab, we're writing a review, is not. And finally, a unique perspective on a topic that only you can provide. So what makes you the right people to write this, and what makes you in the right position to give that perspective, to give that extra little opinion about the field that nobody else could. So rather than just going through the review, going through the references and summarizing them, what can you as a person say about that field that nobody else can? So here's just some quick examples from my personal Hall of Fame. I had a few years ago a proposal about a class of proteins called affibodies, and this is reviewing all the technological applications of them, which is a fine topic. But the thing that put me over here was that this is from the research group that developed these proteins a couple of decades ago. And so they're saying, okay, well, in the last 5 years, this has really gone from sort of a basic discovery-based thing to now people are actually using our technology to do things with, and we're going to review that. One of my favorite articles I've ever published had to do with biofabrication, and this is an appraisal of different technologies for biofabrication, but the authors created a new figure of merit to assess the efficiency of all of these different technologies. So they were looking at things like deposition rate and resolution and complexity of the device to essentially rate each of these technologies independently and how useful they might be for practice. I had an industrial group that works on developing better qPCR reagents, and they together wrote a user's guide to performing qPCR. This is still my most read article of all time, even though we published it about 2 or 3 years ago at this point. I had some of the organizers of a Gordon Research Conference get together after their conference ended and say, hey, we have this really great perspective on the topic of this conference now is on personalized and precision medicine. And based on everything that we've seen covered in this conference, here's where we think the field is going next. And finally, I had a review about CRISPR-based biosensing. And this is not necessarily from the person who discovered this or the biggest name in the field, but what this author did was give the first really extensive comparison of different CRISPR nucleases for different applications. So this summarized in a really succinct way of, okay, if I want to discover this biomolecule, I'd want to use, Cas13, whereas if I want to do this application, Cas9 is better. And I'll conclude our talk by giving a few do's and don'ts of writing proposals. This is just to summarize what we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes. So again, do include all the information that the journal asks for. If we ask for it on the website, we think it's important, So please pay attention to that. Do explain your own expertise and the relevance of the proposed article for the journal. So this is what we've been talking about in terms of making sure the article is a good fit for our scope. Do indicate the intended article format. As Andrea mentioned, we cannot read your mind. And do customize your proposal for the journal. Again, it's okay if you've previously proposed your idea somewhere else, but we do understand that maybe sometimes you're recycling the proposal and it doesn't reflect well. Don't assume the editor is an expert in the topic of the review. So if you have that really narrow needle to thread about, disease X and device Z, sell your story in a way that the editor, as somebody who's not really an expert, understands why it's exciting. Do inform the editor as soon as possible, excuse me, if you think you're going to need an exception from the guidelines. But don't assume the editor will necessarily be in the position to grant that request. If the editor says no, don't think that means that your proposal is bad. Sometimes there's just not room for it, or it's not a right fit for the scope of the journal. Do seek advice from colleagues, especially ones outside your immediate field, because they'll be in the best position to tell you if that topic is really interesting and accessible for a broad audience. And finally, do explain why the topic is interesting, instead of simply stating that it is. So tell us where that perspective comes from, what that new analysis is, what that personal way of looking at the field is that's really going to differentiate your review from anything else that's out there. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be happy to take some questions now.
Thank you very, very much, Matt and Andrea, for a really interesting webinar. The questions have been rolling in fairly hard. So let me just get to it. Probably a fairly easy question about this. If somebody wants to know if all proposals that are accepted by editors guarantees publication of that review article. Matt, do you want to take that one? Oh, sorry, Andrea, go ahead.
Go ahead, Andrea.
I was saying no. We send the Trends. We send every article out to peer review, and usually 2 to 3 peer reviewers. I think across the Trends journals we have a relatively low rejection rate, but it does happen, and it's always, we never like to reject it once we've agreed to it. It's always I'm so really upsetting, but everything is peer reviewed.
Yeah, to agree with that, by the time that you submit your article, we are heavily invested in wanting your paper to succeed. So we want to be able to accept, but to ensure high quality and to ensure scientific rigor, we do peer review everything. And sometimes it's just not possible after seeing the reviewer comments to proceed with publication.
Thank you very much. Several people have been asking questions about novelty of the review. So how would you ensure that how much novelty is required? And I guess by extension of that, in a review article, what you usually expect is essentially a review of the literature. How do you actually make your review for a trans journal, for example, novel?
Matt, do you want to answer?
Sure, I can start. I think there are a few ways to do novelty. Maybe the most basic or the easiest one is simply, if this is a really hot topic in your field, and this is something that a lot of researchers care about right now, to be the first person to give a comprehensive overview of that topic and maybe some comparison of the different approaches or strategies or things like that, I think that by itself is novel. Another thing you can do is maybe go back and look at old results or old ways of doing things, and if there's a new way to think about them in light of recent data, that could be a way to get novelty. Or I think my best answer is the things I just mentioned, my personal Hall of Fame, having that personal experience of the topic, that angle that nobody else in the world has, and saying, okay, this is how I can analyze this topic and really make a contribution that's beyond just summary.
That's really good. That really made me think. I never thought of do it X and Y way. And that's always a really good example of something that's come across as being novel.
Thank you very much. We've had some questions, really interesting ones actually, about very specific topics. So I'm just going to read out one of them. So this person who's asking the question is a clinician, and he does not have any research or publications, but there is a gap between research and the clinic. So even though the research is there to explain it, somehow, researchers basically stuck in their sort of silos. So how can a person like this, when he sees a gap, write about what he's seeing?
I would say go and talk to the editor of the journal that you're interested in. They may have some suggestions. Even you think, I see a gap and I'm wondering about whether or not this is even something you'd be interested in considering. That's completely fine. You may not, almost like a pre-proposal. Touch base. All the trends editors would really like to hear from people, and we'll give you a quick guidelines of, yep, that's something I might consider, or no, that's too out of scope.
Yeah, ask the editor is always the right answer, I would say. I think in that particular example, if you are a clinician and you see a gap between basic research and clinical practice, I would really encourage you to find a collaborator who is an expert in that basic research. And I think the two of you together can probably give the right insight.
Thank you very much. Another fairly specific question. Some people have asked, to what extent does can you actually propose a mechanism or a model and explain this in a review article? Matt, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, that depends strongly on the journal. So the trends journals do not allow proposals of new formal mathematical models, any sort of meta-analysis, or anything that could be construed as a new research result, we're not going to publish. But in terms of mechanisms, so if you say, okay, I've reviewed all the available data for this particular cell biology process, and I think the data are suggesting that this is the mechanism, I think that could be the basis of a good review article. But again, that does change. And so, some journals are going to be more open than others to new models or to meta-analysis or whatever. Just check with the journal's requirements.
Again, always ask the editor.
Yeah.
Let me see. Here's an interesting one. So you mentioned that 10 to 20 recent referenced, the references that you have should be, not too old. They should be fairly new, within the past 2 to 4 years, I believe it was somebody said. So what if the idea in the review article is novel, but all the references are old? What do you do in this case?
You're going to have to do a better job of explaining how it's novel, really, is essentially it. You're going to have to really, really pull that out, really, really show me how that idea is novel. Because I totally agree. Sometimes there are things in ecology and evolution, ideas have waxed and waned in popularity over the years. If you can do that well, then it'll be harder, but you can do it.
And also to show that this is something that the research community is still engaged with. I think we're going to have we're going to be more likely to accept that proposal if it's something that is kind of currently being debated or is foundational for an important topic in the field right now. If this is just sort of like your pet theory of, hey, this body of literature from the 80s is wrong, I think that might not be something that we are inclined to invite you to submit.
Fair enough. Somebody would like to know if writing on a particular topic that has been written before, but concentrating on different geographical areas, is that novel enough as a review article?
For me, if the other areas have been quite small, for example, you say, well, we've found this on lakes and we're applying it to the terrestrial system, for example, that would be, or people have found this. There's been loads and loads of research on this in the Arctic, and we're applying it to Antarctica. You just show why that geographic distinction is important. Research have found this extensively in small alpine streams. We're applying it to big major river systems. Lots of ways of doing it, but it needs to be explain why we need to have that new geographic scope.
Okay, great. Again, application of mathematical models. Would that be something interesting for a trend sort of journal or a review article in general?
I would say that it would need application of mathematical model. You would need to have a bigger question behind it. It's not just the application models. It could be, for example, I had a recent paper talking about how better to apply joint species distribution models to answer ecological questions and range shifts under climate change. Sort of coming into that those kind of ideas, but it's the questions that people are interested in about what limits species range limits that was important, not the modeling that was the interesting question.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think if it's we're going to compare 6 different models for answering the same question, devoid of broader context, we probably would not consider that to be a particularly interesting review paper. But I published something that was pretty recently about different software packages to answer different questions for single-cell multi-omics data. And that wasn't really getting deep into how each software package works, but more the different kinds of questions you can answer with each one. And if you have a particular biological context, which one was most appropriate to investigate that context further.
Fair enough. Thank you. If an editor like yourself say no to a proposal, are the authors allowed to contact you and ask you why and how to perhaps improve the proposal or the review article idea?
I do try to give people reasons as to why. Sometimes I just simply don't have the time. If you ask why, I try to give you a reason. Not always possible, but if you come back to me and say, "Can you tell me why?" I'll always take the effort to respond.
Yeah, and the reason often really is simply, I don't have the time or the space to take on this proposal, even though it could be interesting. That's not us trying to blow you off. That's us saying we have limited bandwidth. This is our full-time job, but we can't take infinite number of articles.
Thank you. When one is writing a multidisciplinary research article, a review article, how does one decide which journal to approach first?
That's a good question. Think about your audience. Who do you want reading your paper? And how best to match your paper to your intended audience? Probably would be my number one suggestion. You might end up going for a different sort of journal. For example, the journal Sheba primarily works on is iScience, is entirely focused on interdisciplinary paper ideas. So someone else might be a better call if you actually really do want to get those 2 different fields. So really think about that. And within the trends group, sometimes we do say, "Oh, I'm not really sure." What do you think, Matt? Where do you think this would fit? Do you think it would fit better with trends in ecology and evolution or trends in biotechnology? So we sometimes do talk amongst ourselves, but you shouldn't rely on us doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so sometimes, to give another example, I might get a proposal on cancer nanotherapy. And I just have too many papers on therapeutics and drug delivery that I don't necessarily want to take on a new one, but maybe my colleagues in trends in cancer or trends in pharmacological sciences do want to take that on. And so, sometimes, again, we'll have that discussion internally, and it might end up in a different place anyway.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Are review articles allowed to have some research in there as well, some primary research?
Typically, no. But if it's very, very small, we might allow it. But I mean, also this is also going to be journal dependent. If there's going to be a big chunk of primary research and a big chunk of review, talk to the editor. There might be other places that are better than a purely reviews journal. So there are a lot of journals out there that would be totally happy with that.
Yeah, I would say this depends very strongly on which journal you're considering. I probably would not publish a paper like that, but I know our colleague at Trends in Genetics, they've been doing some things with a little bit of reanalysis of old genetics data using new methods. And that sort of crosses the line. I mean, maybe that's new content, maybe it's not, but they do allow a little bit of that. I would not rely on a particular journal allowing original research content in a review. Certainly many of the trends journals do not, but it's never wrong to ask the editor.
Yeah, I've allowed people to do something like, we've got published data from here and we've matched it up against published weather data, for example. Like this is first flowering data, we've matched it up against temperature in December. Both published, but the correlation is new. That sort of thing. But ask the editor.
Thank you. Must an editor invite us or the authors to prepare a proposal for a review article?
No, that's the whole point of the proposal. Is that so sometimes, yes, we will invite you to write a review for us. But if we haven't invited you, the proposal is your way of asking for an invitation.
And sometimes I'll be talking to people at a conference, and they'll say, "Oh, I've got this idea," and they'll talk with it. They say, "Yeah, are you interested?" I'm like, "Well, write me a proposal," and that's a lot of the time it's because I'm thinking, "Oh my God, I can't think of this. This is like a conference, too many ideas, too much going on." So I'm sort of punting the idea into the future. But if you talk to an editor at a conference and they say that, always follow up and write the proposal. It means that I've thought that initially your idea sounds great.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me see. There's so many questions coming in. It's hard to sort of like sift through them all. Very specific question again. How can someone bring a novelty in a review article in the development of a technology? So if there's a refinement of a technology, how do you would you be able to write a review article on just basis of this?
Yeah, very likely. I deal with this all the time. If it's a sort of thing that has been researched mostly at lab scale, I've seen some interesting reviews about commercialization or about scale up, about ways to make the technology more efficient or more stable or whatever. And where the novel perspective here is taking it from the lab and putting it into practice. So yes, I think that's certainly valid. Thank you.
Andrew, do you have anything to add to that?
I don't think so. I don't. It's not something I get a lot of.
Okay, fair enough. Let me see. Yeah, so there's a very specific question again about affiliations. If a researcher does not belong to any affiliation, if they're an independent researcher, are they also still allowed to propose and write reviews?
Absolutely fine. I had someone independent reviewer, emeritus professor, who wrote a letter recently and does not have an affiliation. Absolutely fine.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think most of the questions that I see have been answered. Are there any last words that you would like to say about writing reviews proposals here before I round up the webinar?
Well, a lot of the time the answer is talk to the editor. We're totally happy to have and all the trends editors and most of the other editors, all the other editors at Cell Press are always happy to be contacted.
Yeah, I'll conclude by, I just saw a question pop up here. How many proposals do I typically receive within a year? In a typical year, about 300. In this year, it's going to be, she gets a lot more than I do, yeah. This year, it's going to be more than 600 probably. So just a massive increase relative to our baseline. And therefore, because we're not publishing that many more papers, I'm having to reject a lot more proposals. I just really want to emphasize that this is not me saying I don't like you or I don't like your topic or your proposal is bad. This is just, we don't have the space for it. We might be willing to reconsider it in the future. I am very happy that you're interested in writing for my journal. It makes me feel great. And I don't like turning authors down, but sometimes it's just inevitable. But please continue to ask us. I mean, just because we have a lot of proposals doesn't mean that we don't want any more, right?
Fair enough. Thank you guys so much. This has been so informative, and I'm sure that the people listening in have taken away a lot of really good points for them to write their next proposal for a review. So I'm going to round this up now just by giving a little bit more information. A lot of you asked on where to get these slides for this presentation. Please review this. You can actually review all of these and other articles that are on the Researcher Academy webinar page. We've collected these materials for you because they're very, very relevant to what it is that all of you are doing. Thank you very, very much for your attention. If there are some questions that you've had that have not been answered that we haven't had the time for, don't worry. You can actually raise any of these outstanding questions on the Researcher Academy website. The link of this can be found under the resources page on the bottom right of the webinar page that you're looking at right now. And finally, and this is probably the information that you probably want to know the most, if you didn't manage to catch all of the webinar, if you want a copy of the slides, you can actually also view this webinar again on demand from the Researcher Academy website. Please also, this is also the place to claim your certificate for attendance and learn about other tools, events, and courses. And for now, all that is left for me to say is thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Matt and Andrea, and have a very, very nice day wherever you are.